Good day, my Janites. I'm the Austen Reviewer. So Northanger Abbey is actually more of a satire piece. Most of her works had a fair bit of satire in them, just kind of deconstructing some of the romance tropes at the time, which is entertaining, but that's a history thing. We'll get into that in a proper video later. Northanger Abbey was published after Jane Austen passed away, but was written actually earlier generally than most of her other novels. It was a satire piece of the Gothic romances that were very popular at that time. They had already waned in popularity by quite a bit by the time it was actually published after her death, but the rights for it had actually been bought by a book company, and we really don't need to get into this history right now, do we? We'll do a video on that later. So, talking to Jane Austen fans, there's a very real sense that the two books that are never generally done very well for adaptations are Mansfield Park and Northanger Abbey. Mansfield Park we'll get into eventually. There's not very many adaptations of it. I think there are technically more of Northanger Abbey, but that's a separate topic. So the one that we're reviewing today is from 2006, called Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. So I have had a couple comments that my plot synopsises run really long, so I'm going to try to tighten it up a bit. I'm going to go back to what I did in my first review, where I used pictures to kind of convey the plot along, because that way I can just read my notes and just get it done straight. So let's do that. Here's the plot synopsis of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey 2006 movie. So opening narration introduces us to our main character, Catherine Morland. Mr. and Mrs. Allen, some good friends of the family, invite her to go with them to Bath. She wants to go out right away, but Mrs. Allen insists that they have to go shopping in order to fit in there. They go to a ball where they meet Mr. Tilney, and she dances with him. The next day out, they then meet the Thorpes. Catherine and Isabella meet John and James. They go dancing, they meet Mr. and Mrs. Tilney. They plan for going for a walk. The Thorpes come and convince Catherine that the Tilneys aren't coming, but she sees them on the drive, and she gets quite angry at Mr. Thorpe. But they then have to turn back before they get to their destination anyway. Catherine sees the Tilneys again at the opera and apologizes. Mr. Thorpe tells General Tilney Catherine is rich. She goes walking with them the next day, to the General's great pleasure. Isabella and James get engaged. Mr. Thorpe clumsily proposes to Catherine. Next day she dances with Henry at a ball. Isabella dances with Captain Tilney after saying that she won't. The next day Isabella seems disappointed when she finds out that there's not going to be much money involved in the marriage, just a simple living that won't take place for a while, though she insists that this is because they can't get married for a while. General Tilney invites Catherine to Northanger Abbey. Isabella makes Catherine aware that John thinks they are engaged. Isabella flirts more with Captain Tilney. Catherine rides with Henry to Northanger. There's a very awkward dinner conversation. She finds a chest in her room and has a bunch of papers inside she thinks might be from some secret special thing going on, but is disappointed when she finds out that they're only a laundry list. Miss Tilney then tells Catherine about her mother's sudden passing. General Tilney stops them, though, when she goes to show her her mother's room. General Tilney then goes to London. Henry shows Catherine his home. They have a nice talk about it. They also talk about their father's expectations. Catherine sneaks into the mother's old room, where she doesn't find anything interesting, but Henry catches her just as she's about to leave and confronts her flights of fancy, which she has been letting get away with her, that somehow the general has either killed his wife or is keeping her captive somewhere in the house. She then gets a letter from James telling her that the engagement is over. Shortly after this, Isabella writes to try to get Catherine to reconcile her and her brother after her failed conquest of Captain Tilney. General Tilney returns abruptly and evicts Catherine in the middle of the night. Eleanor gives Catherine some money so she can actually get home. Catherine realizes she's in love with Henry around this point. When she is home and her parents are happy she's safe, and they are also impressed that she was able to get home by herself, Henry comes along and explains that Thorpe had misled his general first into thinking that Catherine was rich, and then into thinking that Catherine was absolutely destitute. Henry himself doesn't really care about Catherine's fortune, thus he has come to propose to her in defiance of his father, who now wants him to have nothing to do with her because she is not rich. They propose, and they get married pretty much immediately. That's the end of the story. So how does this fare as just a movie? Well, the cinematography is quite lovely. The colors get brighter the more kind of she gets acquainted with the world, which is kind of a nice touch. Yeah, I had no issues with the cinematography. I thought the acting was mostly well done. They could have probably played up a little more that Northanger Abbey is kind of a satire on Gothic romances in general, but they did have a few kind of dream sequences which are really played up and I think kind of convey a little bit of that kind of feeling. As far as the setting went, everything worked really well. There were a couple little issues with wardrobe stuff. This again comes down to my ranting about gloves, but you've kind of gotten used to that by now. So as for the actual notes proper on the actual production, the opening narration is actually very much almost word for word straight out of the book, which is quite a nice touch. It shows some good respect for their source material, and the images they choose to overlay over it also kind of enforce that entire idea. Mrs. Allen is properly airheaded. She means well. She's not the smartest character in all of the book. With a lot of these things, they've rolled a lot of events all into one. So the introduction by the Master of Ceremonies for the dance, the fact that the first ball that she went to, she didn't actually get to dance with anyone, but that would be somewhat boring to try to convey, I suppose. I did think that they did a good job when they selected the actress for Catherine. She looks young and naive enough to kind of get away with this, but you do also get that uncomfortableness that she feels that is touched on in the book, where other people around her are doing things that they societally should not be doing, and she doesn't necessarily outright know the society rules, but she does know that something is off with their behavior. At the ball, she has her gloves rolled up to her hands, which is kind of an odd way of wearing them, but I was just happy that she was at least wearing gloves. Thorpe wasn't at that particular ball. The dialogue is in general pretty accurate to the book, which is nice. They did skip the issue with the Thorpes kind of about the second walk that they went on, but that's a different thing. The one creative decision that I wasn't as confident that I would have made in their situation was they actually show Thorpe telling General Tilney that Catherine is rich. This is something that she was completely unaware of until the very end of the book, and when you discover that Thorpe's aspirations of his marrying her himself and her brother being engaged to his sister caused him to inflate the consequence and the worth of anyone that he liked. So he made her out to be very rich, and then when he fully realized that she had completely and totally rejected him as far as marriage went, and that his sister was no longer engaged to the brother, he then sunk their supposed wealth to being absolute poverty, like she was some kind of crazy gold digger, which was also not true. It was kind of in the middle. So I wasn't... So you can see that this is based on misinformation. So in some ways you're almost expecting it to get found out eventually, but it does, I think, take a little bit of the suspense out of the rest of the plot. They have a sequence which pretty blatantly foreshadows Eleanor's love interest, even though in the movie it doesn't actually go anywhere, so I don't know if maybe there's a cut somewhere where it does, but it doesn't, so there's that. They show the trip happening all in one day, and she rides the entire way with Henry, but it actually took 2 days. They had to overnight in an inn, and she spent the first in the carriage with General Tilney and Eleanor, and then the second with Henry when they actually went to Northanger. Henry actually tells her a story about, or makes up kind of a Gothic story because he knows she's interested in them, about maybe finding a cabinet in the room with hidden papers and this, that, and another thing. And while there is a cabinet in the room she stays in, she doesn't get fascinated by it. She gets fascinated by a trunk, which she does do and looks into and discovers is full of linen in the book. In this one, they roll the chest and the cabinet into one because she finds the papers in the cabinet. Her light gets blown out and she drops the papers on the floor to discover them the next morning. So they rolled that in with the chest as opposed to her opening the chest before she actually goes down to supper. I did notice that Eleanor's dress during this particular sequence when they're at Northanger is much more of an older style, but considering the general's tastes, that might actually be in character for her to dress more modernly when she's in Bath and much more conservatively / old when she's at home. So I didn't take too much issue with that one. The other thing is, because this one was written so much earlier than the rest of her novels, that style of dress actually might make a little more sense for the time period. They skip the tour of the house by General Tilney, where Eleanor almost leads to her mother's room, but he shuts them down there. They do have him preventing them from going again, which did happen in the book again as well, so I guess they just cut out the one instance altogether. The visit to Henry's home actually took place with General Tilney, who was very particular about asking Catherine's opinion, and very much kind of pushing that he was hoping she'd be the mistress of it eventually. So they skipped that because he's not there in the movie, but this is where kind of the lack of gloves got a little out of hand, but they were also on a private estate, so maybe it's a little more excusable in this case. So Catherine receives the letter from her brother and is royally confused by what's going on. She actually received that letter, though, in the house with both Henry and Eleanor present, who were both concerned but were polite not to ask questions until she started volunteering information to kind of get their opinion to help her try to figure out what the heck was going on. They also have a pretty blatant demonstration of Isabella having sex with Captain Tilney, which you could take as being kind of implied, but I think also messes a little bit with the character portrayal of her. They try to make her out to be both more innocent and more guilty of her flirtatious behavior all at the same time, and I think if they would have tried to stick with one or the other, they might have done a little better. Her disappointment, though, is fairly palpable. The suddenness of the general's return was accurate, but he made her leave very, very early in the morning, not actually properly in the middle of the night. So there was that. Eleanor, though, did give Catherine some money in order for her to help her find her way back. Now, where Eleanor's love interest foreshadowing would have made more sense is when you get to the very end of the story. They have Henry go and find Catherine, and they get married right there and then. That's not quite how it happened in the book. In the book, Catherine's parents were very moral. They were, her father is a clergyman. They were not willing to let her get married without the consent of Henry's father. So they couldn't get married for a couple of years until the man that Eleanor was in love with, who was the second son, suddenly came into money and was able to be then an appropriate match for her, according to the general. That put him in a good mood. He was then more willing to listen to the actual case of Henry and Catherine and the fact that she wasn't destitute and poor, and he then actually consented to their marriage. So as far as things goes, it's actually a pretty darn loyal adaptation. The character portrayal of Isabella was a little bit inconsistent. You could definitely sense shades of kind of her more conniving nature, which I suppose isn't bad, but you could get some very different impressions of the character from watching this movie versus reading the book. Catherine, I thought, was done quite well. Again, they could have done maybe a little more with just the satire side of the story, but it works perfectly functionally as a movie the way they did it, so it's actually not too bad. It's better than every other version of Northanger Abbey that I've seen thus far. But let's put it on the scores. So the only place it really lost points was with some plot accuracy, some character accuracy, and some wardrobe issues with the gloves. So for production value, I gave it its full 30 points out of 30 points. I liked the movie, it gets my point there. It also got 66 points from the combination of the setting, character, and plot scores, giving it a total score of 97 points, which is the highest we've had so far, and making it to date one of the best adaptations that I've seen. So that's definitely something. I would definitely recommend this one. But thank you for watching. Join me next time. I remain as ever till the next time we meet, the Austen Reviewer. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content, share with your friends to help my channel gain a bit more exposure. I would appreciate it if you would have a look at my Patreon. It's not required by any means, but it does help to support me and just allow me to make more of these videos and put them out on a more regular basis. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.